Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Henry Garrido. I'm the Executive Director of District Council 37, the largest municipal union in New York City, representing 150,000 members and about 100,000 retirees together with the families. So today I'm very excited to chair the panel on climate and economic justice as part of a very impressive day that we've had of presentations of climate justice here in New York and climate jobs. And we will have an opportunity for hear from three very distinct panelists, and then hear from your questions, have an opportunity to interact. But first, before I get to introduce the panelists today, which we're joined by Larry Williams Jr., John Cartwright, and Candis Tolliver. You'll hear from, about their bias before. I have to say that from the perspective of labor, from my perspective, I have witnessed firsthand some of the worst environmental injustices affecting people of color. Flint, Michigan was a fundamental, a very clear, stark example of environmental racism, where people of color were so affected by the access to quality of good water. You know, it's amazing to think that the Black and brown population of Michigan represents only 14% of the population, yet 84% of all the water who was contaminated was in those neighborhoods. And we have seen this time and time again. We have seen problems with air quality in areas of the South Bronx, where people of color are being affected more. And of course, COVID-19 became the most recent and more stark example of what air quality, access to good quality water, and environmental injustice can mean. So today we have an excited panel, and let me get right to it. First, let me start by introducing Larry Williams Jr. He is the Sierra Club's labor and coal coordinator. Larry Williams Jr. Is a seasoned organizer and a labor leader, which to me, that's it. You start there, you end there. That's the greatest qualification you would get, Larry, as a unionist myself. He has served as vice president and shop steward to enforce contract protections for GML members. He believes in equality between employers and employees at headquarters in the field at all levels. He also wants to create a real network to where members' concerns can be heard. Lastly, he wants to ensure that employees will, from this point forward, feel that they can stay at Sierra Club for longer, knowing that the future is secure. He is a former 8-year employee of the United Brotherhood of Teamsters, Organizing and Training and Development Department in Washington-based headquarters. He has worked to organize workers at large multinational corporations like FedEx, Continental Airlines, and First Student. He has led courses on organizing technology for representatives from around the country and works on labor outreach globally. He has spoken at Cornell and studied strategic corporate research at the Cornell University of International Labor Relations under the Professor Kate Brunfenberger. He's also a founding member of the DC-based firm that specializes in labor education and new technology organizing called unionbase.org. So without further ado, please let's welcome Larry Williams Jr. Larry.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gallardo. I also want to just add for context, some folks may recognize me as a former president of Progressive Workers Union that represents employees from several prominent environmental organizations around the country. And I bring that up because contextually, I think this is a moment where more than ever before, we should see the intersections between environmental justice and economic justice. And, you know, during my time working at the Sierra Club, I learned quite a bit about the ways that the labor movement has been involving itself in climate fights, from the SEIU signing an environmental justice pact some years ago, to organizations like the IBEW working with environmental workers at the local level, in many different states for clean energy, but also thinking about the fact that at this time, you know, one of the best ways we've been able to win victories in environmental and economic justice is by bringing together people who see the joint cause. The fact that we can't have a clean energy economy without, you know, folks who are here to do those jobs, folks who have been traditionally barred from those opportunities. One of the most interesting things that ever happened was hearing someone talk about the fact that we may end up having a new economy where people are actually making clean energy products in prison, like solar panels. And in some cases, those jobs, quote unquote jobs, already exist. I think that the term just transition and its history coming from the oil, atomic and chemical workers is something that's been lost on folks. When people hear the term just transition, we all have different feelings and emotions triggered. But the fact is that the most of the population in the United States, at least, not speaking for Canada, I know John's going to speak on that. A lot of people hear the term just transition and they have no idea what that means. But the truth is that every community should have the power to determine for themselves what just transition is going to look like. And, you know, as tragic as COVID-19 has been, we just reached 200,000 deaths just in the United States alone. This is a major opportunity for us to recreate the economy in the form of one that's just, where people have jobs that pay family sustaining wages, right? Where people have health insurance and the basic needs that they have. I really want to pass it to other panelists, but I really want to close by saying this. You know, no other movement besides the labor movement has had such a clear, I think, set of skills to approach the problem that is economics, right? But one of the things that we need to do is we need to evolve that plan to involve the metamorphosis that the population is taking on. What I mean by that is the majority of people who are in unions are people of color and women. Yet at this time, we still don't see that completely reflected, at least in the United States, when it comes to the leadership of the labor movement. We have some unions that reflect that more than others. And we have a lot of unions that have a great history of pressing for societal change when it comes to race, when it comes to class. But for our movement to really be successful, we need to understand we have to be bringing in new generations of workers, and we have to be appealing to the issues that they care about. I can't wait to hear from other panelists, but I just want to have this conversation in the context of not just looking at the problems that we see, but also thinking about the solutions that we can bring to those problems. And if you leave this panel with that in mind, then we've been successful at our jobs.
Thank you, Larry. And I might add, thank you for bringing that up. As a leader, it's not just an issue of race, it's also an issue of gender. We need more women in the leadership of the labor movement, as exemplified by one of the panelists that we have here today. So I thank you to bring that up. Next is on our panel is John Cartwright, who is the president of the Toronto and York Regional Labor Council, representing 220,000 union members in Canada, largest urban center. A carpenter by trade, John has served on a number of public boards. It is the national chair of the Council of Canadian and vice chair of the United Way of Greater Toronto. And he is also the co-chair of the Toronto Community Benefits Network, focused on winning community benefits and equity, hiring on major infrastructure projects. Over the years, he has helped develop the Campaign for Public Education, Public Transit for the Public Good, Toronto Water Watch, and Toronto Hydro campaigns to defend vital public services in Toronto. John has been deeply involved in apprenticeship and training issues, as well as crafting the Green Job Strategy for the Canadian Labour Congress. He recently authored the Green Print for Greater Toronto, a plan for climate action in every sector of the economy. So please let me welcome John Cartwright. John?
Thanks, Brother Garrido. It's an honor to be there. I want to start by acknowledging the amazing work that folks in Climate Jobs New York have done in modeling this way. I know many of the people, have been in a long career path through the labor movement and have put incredible energy and wisdom into trying to figure out this problem that's in front of us. So I'm going to start by saying, in the context of what a just transition means, or a just recovery for all, that can't happen without a labor movement that's committed to taking on issues of racial justice. And that, it's been reflected in the panels before us, but I just want to start by saying absolutely that. In Toronto, half of us are people of color, and half of us have been born outside of Canada. And so our labor movement has been trying to, commit to a serious equity agenda for many years, and constantly learning from our own leaders and activists of color in what those answers are. I come out of construction, but I want to say that, one of the things that's important for us to imagine is that a just transition is not just about energy and construction and transit, people putting solar panels. That there is an opportunity for every sector of the economy to move to low carbon. And that includes schools and hotels and hospitals and, municipal buildings and services, as well as, green energy and manufacturing for green products. In our industry in Toronto, I ended up taking the lead of our building trades in the early 90s when we were going into the worst recessions since the dirty 30s, and 40% of people unemployed. We were very highly unionized. We're one of the most highly unionized in North America. But we were faced with a huge challenge. What do we do? How do we put people back to work? And we ended up connecting with some leading environmental thinkers, some engineers, and some city councilors who agreed to put together a program called the Better Buildings Partnership. That was an energy retrofit program supported by the city and working with the union trades in order to roll out a program of doing retrofits. Now, at that point in time, there were a lot of skeptics. People saying, just give us a big mega project, that's what we need. But the first piece under this program put hundreds of people back to work who've been unemployed, and some were on the risk of losing their housing. And suddenly the skepticism, moved away and people started being interested. Since that program was started, 46,000 years worth of work have been created by one municipal program created through the union movement, working with progressive city councilors and others in the environmental movement. And that success has allowed us to be able to advocate across other sectors to say, we know it's not about jobs versus the environment, we can have both. And so the validation is really important, because as many people have said today, this is about, starts with jobs and ends with jobs, and in between about what kind of justice does it look like, but people got to have the capacity to put food on the table. The mentioned in my introduction, the Community Benefits Network. We went down to LA about a decade ago and talked to them about how they moved an equity hiring program through the construction trades as they were trying to get public support for a massive transit expansion. Came back to Toronto, talked to our political leaders and said, we want to take that model and apply it to Toronto. We've since created the capacity to require local equity hiring into construction trades for major infrastructure programs. And then we've, it's one thing for us to build green buildings or retrofit green buildings, but day in and day out, those buildings can lose energy efficiency or maintain them. And I want to honor 32BJ, because the work they did in creating the Green Superintendents Program meant that when you do these retrofits, the people running those buildings are now absolutely on top of that, and there's value added in the skills that they apply. I also want to say that it's in Canada, at least, when we talk about a just transition and a greener economy, we also talk about the care sector. We talk about frontline people in healthcare, and of course, they're our heroes through COVID, but we also talk about childcare workers. We talk about education and education workers, because those are low carbon jobs that allow our economy to prosper. Wealth creation is not just about private sector generating, widgets or putting up buildings. It's about our social capital and the wealth we create together for a more prosperous society. And I'll end on this. A number of people have said, if you want to win this fight, it's got to be bottom-up led. And one of the things we've been trying to figure out is how do we task activists in our movement to take their passion on climate and bring it inside the union, go to the workplace and say, how do we make this a lower carbon workplace? What skills do we need? And it's very much like the journey our health and safety activists and movement took on 30 and 40 years ago. What are the skills we need? What are the regulations required? What's the training required? How do we force the employer to do the right thing? And at the end of the day, we've got a better outcome. It's a similar journey I think we have to take on climate. And part of that is, where do local unions fit in? Where do local activists fit in? How do we take a workplace agenda and sit down with their employers and bargain that to have a low carbon future for every sector? Thanks. Henry, you're on mute.
Thank you, John. I'm sorry. I appreciate your comments. And before we get to Candis, who had to get off momentarily from the camera, I just want to say that part of what we're facing, and something you said to me struck really hard, which is the economic effect and downfall of the effects of COVID. Now we're hurting the very same people who are doing the frontline work. Like right here in New York City, we're facing 22,000 layoffs by October 1st. Many of them are jobs in the Department of Design and Construction, who done environmentally retrofitting of solar panels, and the School Construction Authority, who are doing fitting schools with water retention systems, and the Parks Department, who is doing incredible jobs in stopping erosions of, you know, some of the short line here in New York City. And yet, for the sake of economic downturn, right, for the sake of the economy picking up, this is another effect. So I appreciate very much your comments. So let me turn it over to Candis. Hello, Candis. You know, I feel funny reading some of Candis' bios, because this is like a sister from another mother. But let me try to do justice to Candis Tolliver, who is the political director of 32BJ, SEIU. He was one of the strongest forces in the fight for a higher minimum wage that gained national attention, and particularly here in New York, which transformed the lives of thousands of people. Prior to her tenure there at 32BJ, Candis oversaw the New York Civil Liberties Union's New York City police reform efforts, and managed the NYCLU's state organizing portfolio, which included supporting the work of professional development of the organizers there. Candis has earned a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Norfolk State University and a Master's in Urban Policy from the New School. She was named one of the Albany's 40 under 40 Rising Stars in 2016. Her leadership includes serving on the board of directors of longtime North Star Fund grantee, Picture, The Homeless, the only organization founded and led by homeless people to provide space and resources to organize and lead the fight to end New York City's decades of lone housing crisis. Without further ado, let me introduce not a rising star, but a star that has come, my sister, Candis Tolliver. Candis.
Hi, Henry. Hi, everyone. Thank you for that introduction. So 32BJ, and actually, I don't want to go long and repeat a lot of what the other panelists have said. Larry spoke a lot about the intersection of racial justice and climate justice, and how we ensure that Black and brown people and low-income people are, you know, not left behind in the conversation about climate change and climate justice, because they bear the brunt of so many long-time policies and practices that have negatively impacted our communities. And then John talked a lot about the jobs. One of the things I just kind of wrote down what you were saying while you were talking, John, when you said it starts with jobs and ends with jobs. And so I think that's where I come in on this panel to talk about the work and how we ensure that as we transition and as we have this just transition, we ensure that the folks that are most impacted by climate change are the folks that are benefiting from jobs that are created to make sure that we have a green society. And so one of the things that 32BJ has done, and we actually started in 2009, the 32BJ Trading Fund started a program called the Green Supers Training Program. And it's because we saw, right? We saw that the city was moving more and more toward making sure that our buildings were green. When you look at New York City buildings consume about 70% of our total energy. And therefore they became sort of the target of like, right, we want to green the city. What do we go after? And everyone said buildings, right? Let's figure out how to make our buildings more green. But no one was talking about the workers. We represent, building service workers. Our workers, clean the buildings. They're the supers, they're the porters, they're, the security officers in these buildings. And so how do we ensure that those folks are trained and ready to take on the work when you start to talk about moving the work and starting to think about how we make these jobs green jobs and how we make these buildings green buildings. And so we started this program back in 2009 and almost in over 10 years, we've seen a lot of successes. We've had thousands of members trained on this program of how to retrofit the buildings. So they would do things, things to upgrade the building, things, low cost operations and maintenance things like, tuning boilers, insulating pipes, air sealings, things that actually had a big impact on emissions and how the buildings were running, but were low cost. But even as we continue to shift to new technologies to ensure that the buildings are green, it's on us to make sure that the workers are equipped and ready to handle those jobs. So they're not, bringing in new people and bringing in folks that don't look like us and weren't the folks who were working in those buildings year after year to do this work, because our members can do this work and they care about this work because their communities are most impacted by climate change and climate injustice. And so that's how we came to the conversation. I thank you all for having me on this panel, and I look forward to the next level of this conversation.
Thank you very much, Candis. And now we're going to turn over to you, to the members who participate. We want to have a conversation. I know some of the questions have already come through. And so I'm going to ask shortly to have our brother, Jeremy John, who has been filling some of those questions already. And we're going to bring him in. But I think I'm going to start with the first one, because I think part of the problem that we've seen from the perspective of labor and the leadership is some of the union leaders believe that the just transition that Larry was talking about, it's going to lead to the displacement of long-standing union jobs, right? Obviously, we know the coal industry, we know areas like that. But every time I speak in very hush rooms where very few people are, and I talked about divesting, there seems to be a silence or an excitement. It's either one or the other. Either folks are really excited about it and ready to talk about it, or you could hear that silence where people just overtly don't want to explain and say exactly what they're thinking. But when you get them to sort of ease up a little bit, you hear a lot of resistance and saying, well, I have a lot of people in this industry and that industry, and they think that is going to lead to a displacement of those jobs. And I think this is something that, if we're honest with ourselves, we have to accept it. So let me start with you, Larry, as an organizer. I mean, why would you say to people who, some union leaders that you talked about, say that they want to protect the jobs of their constituency that's there, and that we should just wait a little longer?
It's a great question. I have been having these types of conversations for a long time. Just for context, coming out of the Teamsters, which is a super, they've got a long culture and history, over 100 years, like some of the really great unions that have been mentioned today. And then you've got your, folks who are doing these traditional jobs, and the plumbers and pipe fitters, the IBEW. In my mind, these unions are super key to this new economy that, we're going to create, right? And there's always a lot of pressure in, the oil and coal industry and the unions that represent those workers, because they're already under a lot of economic pressure. they're really vulnerable to the pressures of, you know, how much of these resources are being used and whether or not these fluctuations are going to create layoffs anyway. And then there's also the idea that, you know, carbon reduction and the resulting job loss from, you know, less usage means less production, which means less need for those workers. But the truth is that, you know, if you have great labor leaders like Candis and like John involved in that conversation and they're at the table, then they're able to make sure that those workers are not going to be excluded when it comes to creation of the new jobs. The idea around project labor agreements, community benefits agreements is that, you know, you're thinking, all right, if we're going to create this new energy system, for example, then we have to not only take into account how those community members are going to be able to afford that new energy, how that's going to be distributed, but also who's going to be benefiting from those jobs, right? Whether we're talking about a Black community or a white community, let's face it, usually the poor community is the one that gets left out of that conversation, right? And then if they're poor and people of color, then they're double left out of the conversation. But the fear usually comes from not having experience. And I know from being in both those environmental conversations and being in those labor conversations, we're usually talking about two different things. As a labor leader, I'm negotiating specifics of what my members are going to get, how long it's going to take for them to get it, what are our protections in the workplace. If I'm an environmental organization, I'm thinking about the power grid and, you know, 10, 20, 30 years out. A lot of labor leaders don't have the benefit of having that conversation because they have to protect their members now. They have people losing their houses now. So having that job of trying to get those folks to be in the same conversation on the same wavelength is very difficult. But the truth is there are leaders out there like the ones that you have in front of you today who are juggling that and then talking about the now. I'm going to say one last thing here because I think my panelists are going to, our co-panelists are going to say something interesting here. But I think that to be a great labor leader, in my opinion, means that you are respecting what your members are asking you for, right? And you're respecting the difficult situations they're in, but you're also telling them the truth. And you're letting them know if an industry is headed in a direction that you're not going to be able to bring it back. And you're not just giving them that truth, you're also helping them educate themselves and be able to be future thinkers as well. So I don't want to just put it on the labor leader. I think that union members also have a responsibility to engage that conversation and not make labor leaders feel like they're going to be in trouble next election if they even broach this topic. I hope that answers the question.
Without a doubt. Thanks, Larry. The question, well, any of the panelists want to add to this? So the first question, as we get Jeremy here, it comes from Peggy Deemer, who is asking whether, in fact, any of the organizations have engaged architects and architects who design the buildings and could lead to retrofit efforts. I'll speak for myself. I represent the largest number of architects in the city of New York. We have them in multiple agencies, whether it's the School Construction Authority, that not only created their own environmental chapter, but actually have developed a book on environmental practices before LEED was the standard for many of these institutions. They've gone way beyond the LEED Platinum model. And I mentioned what the work that they're doing with water recapturing, the work that they're doing with solar panel, the work that they're doing in just good, smart, clean design that in many instances people thought were against sort of like the architectural DNA of the city of New York. You know, I in former life actually studied architecture myself, and I've heard in these cycles all these arguments about how we somehow violating some the ghost of New York City's past in these designs, and as well as the people in the Department of Design and Construction. But never again have I seen, never before have I seen such a stark contact with the architects and engineers of the School Construction Authority. There lies a prime example where you have primarily people of color, low-income individuals who have been affected by this, you know, probably more than anybody else. where you have led in the housing authority, where you've had, and you've seen, you know, roofs collapsing, you know, you've seen other environmental catastrophes really affecting people, where the children have been predominantly sick, where they are now on the court order, on federal court order, basically mandating that they do remediation, but yet there's no resources available for it. And now we're about to go into a post-pandemic world where those resources are going to be even worse. And the result of people who are doing very good environmental retrofitting jobs in the housing authority, which is represent, depending who you ask, population of 700,000 people in New York here and across the country, other authorities, they don't have the resources. We don't have the money to fix it. Yet we have money to send people to the hospitals and feed mammoth healthcare hospitals who are, you know, literally, in my opinion, taking advantage of the public. So that's just my 2 cents on this. I do think that there's a lot, but if anybody want to act the role of architects in the organizing, in the design, in the retrofitting, please do.
Well, I guess being a construction worker, I could say we do actually have a formal partnership now with the Green Building Council to look at moving massively to low carbon, because every building in Canada, you know, in future years will have to be net zero. And so a number of building trades unions and our Labor Council has struck that partnership for advocacy, both for, you know, building code regulations, but also putting actually the issue of equity and racial inclusion right on the front burner of that partnership on behalf of our movement, but also on behalf of the kind of place we're trying to build. Because I want to go really back to the other question, Henry, if it's all right for a minute. And that, you know, if people are in the high emitting industries, they do have reason to be afraid. The history is the billionaires have turned their back and they've shipped, you know, production wherever and turned to gig economy jobs to replace whatever, you know, they have an offshore. So there's good reason for working people to be cynical. But it's how we define ourselves as labor. You know, our Labor Council was formed in 1871. It was around economic and social justice. But after the Second World War, when people came back from that war, said we got to have racial justice as part of that conversation as well. And it's only in the last 20 years that we put climate justice into the fourth pillar of our work as a labor movement. And when I talk to labor leaders, I ask them, what's your leadership being shown in each of those 4 areas? And certainly in the trades, it's very simple to say, we can have the same job, make the same money, use the same skills to build good stuff that's going to be about a low carbon future for everybody, or to build the same old crap, the same urban sprawl, you know, the same toxic production processes that some you know, billionaire wants to do. Or we can be the advocates saying, let us use our skills for the right outcome. And that's a crucial question that in our country, we had a federal task force on just transition that was went across the country 2 years ago, looking at how to move away from all coal generation. And it was co-chaired by Hassan Youssef, the president of our Canadian Labour Congress. You know, and 3 of the 4 top officers of our Labour Congress in Canada are workers of color. And Hassan co-chaired that to say, if you are going to tell people they got to move away from coal, you have to have, you know, responsible investment in those very communities to say there'll be something, not flipping hamburgers or pack up your tools and move to another part of the country. And that Samantha Smith, who heads up the Just Transition Center that spoke earlier on today, and Sharon Burrow from ITUC, you know, those are fundamental core values that when we talk about just transition are absolutely woven through worker empowerment and being at the table to determine what's important for our communities, and the outcome and how our skills are used are all crucial to that answer.
Thank you. And the next question comes from Jeffrey Grabelski. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Here's the question. He asks, what insights can any of you offer about how we center the struggle against white supremacy and for racial justice in working to reverse climate change and other labor fights by persuading members and leaders that being anti-fascist is both morally right and strategically smart? Does anybody want to take this
Candis,
Question from Jeffrey.
Oh, you could go ahead, Larry.
Okay, no problem. You know, I'm really, really glad to see this question. The first thing I want to do is point out that I think in the past, when we talked about anti-fascism or white supremacy, we did it in the very hypothetical. But now, you know, not only do we have a president who stands directly in the light of white supremacy, but it's not difficult to go online if you are so inclined to find that there are many, many groups who are actively organizing, whether it's QAnon or, you know, people on 4chan. There's many, many groups of young, mostly angry white men who are organizing in the name of white supremacy. And we need to be thinking, yes, about how to win the hearts and minds of people who are vulnerable to that type of ideology. And I think that, you know, it's a battle that we shouldn't completely give up on. But as a person of color who's been in this movement for over 10 years now, I just want to point out that there's lots of Black and brown folks who could also be recruited into this battle, who we have never been reaching out to and touching in a substantive way, right? And in terms of, you know, the way that we push back against that type of ideology in our community, I think that linking climate change and identifying the way that white supremacy is baked into all of the policies that we create is the way that we push back against that. And I'll give you an example. You know, when we're talking about housing, it's very easy to draw a line between how, you know, back in the 50s, you know, we had all these houses that were redlined. We can see the direct correlation between that and who lives where. When it comes to energy policy, you can do the same thing in terms of environmental justice in the communities that Black and brown folks live in, the increased asthma and health problems that we're having because we live near coal plants. So when we're having conversation with state level and federal level officials, we should be first asking ourselves when we create a policy, have we discussed equity? How does this impact the Black community? How does this impact the brown community? And you don't have to be a Black or brown person to do that. You can be a white person and be in a room full of white people and literally ask that question. Now, having been a person that has done that many times, I want to say, you're not always going to get the reaction that you want to get. Sometimes people are going to kind of say, well, we know we haven't, and they're going to completely move on. Sometimes they're going to kind of do a little bit of a song and dance and not really tackle the issue. But I think that it's still worth the effort, and you have to lay those things out and kind of set the gauntlet, or we're never going to make progress on those issues. So in my opinion, there's those two categories at least. There's the literal white supremacy, so people who are actually organizing against Black and brown people and trying to figure out how they can kind of defeat this, you know, what they view as this, you know, coming change in the world that's going to be bad for them. And then there's the like philosophical but very real application of white supremacy in our policies and laws that is so almost baked into our society that we're not aware of it at all.
Thanks, Larry. Candis, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say the way we win is to create a coalition of all of the people who are not the white supremacists, right? And the way you do that is for people to see themselves in the fight. For so long, as a person just growing up, and when I see sort of like the environmentalists or the people who care about the climate, I saw them as like very white, you know, Trader Joe going, flip-flop wearing people. They were not me. This wasn't an issue that mattered to me or my community because I didn't see the link. And it's on us to make sure we show the link. Henry opened up this whole panel talking about Flint. Do you think those folks in Michigan really were thinking about how much climate change was impacting them and how environmental justice or injustice was impacting them before they realized like their water system was fucked up, right? Like that was like an eye opener. Like this is affecting us all. And until we get people to see themselves in this fight and see that this is impacting all of us, we're not going to win. I think for 32BJ and SEIU, we talk about economic justice all the time. But then we realized we had to talk about racial justice as a part of economic justice. We can't have economic justice until we have racial justice. We started to say that about 5 years ago. Now we're saying we can't have economic justice until we have climate justice. We can't have economic justice until we have racial justice. We can't have economic justice until we have immigrant justice, right? Linking all of these justices together to say we can't have one without the other is what has impacted our members the most. For them to realize that we have to fix this in order to really see this. We have to fix the race issue in our country before we could really have a fair system or fair economy where workers are not just disrespected and treated badly because of what they look like, where they live, and what type of jobs that they do. We're not going to win. And so it's about making sure people see themselves in the fight and realize how, how everything is impacting them. And so until you make it personal for someone, they're not going to take this up as an issue, because when you talk about the communities that are most hit by this issue, these are the same communities that are also hardest hit by a lot of other issues. So if I'm worried about putting food on my table and making sure my son gets home from school without being shot by a community member or the police, don't talk to me about these plastic bags that I'm using in my apartment. Right? I don't got time for that. I have other things that I need to focus on, and that's survival. But it's until we link that this plastic bag is about your survival too, people are not going to engage in the fight, but we need everybody to engage in the fight in order to win.
Thank you, Candis. So we have a couple more questions in the queue, but let me turn it over to the person who's been fielding the questions, Jeremy John. Jeremy, do you have questions you want to ask us, and we'll present them to the panelists?
I do. One of the questions that just came in, Henry, is climate justice focuses on grassroots movements making a difference on climate change. What opportunities exist for making a difference?
Any other panel?
Well, I'll take a crack at it. I mean, the first opportunity is listening to young people that are being organizing, across our world. And until COVID hit, we're saying, how dare you not take this seriously, not understand this is a war that humankind must fight. And there's, a lot of very interesting parallels between what, the world's democracies did in the Second World War to defeat fascism and Nazism, and how whole sections of our economy were transitioned overnight for a purpose. And that question of, can we transition for a purpose to win this issue about how humankind will still be on this planet in 2 generations from now is pretty much there. So finding for the labor movement to find a way for young activists, young members, to see themselves in this struggle, and just going back to that, do they see themselves in this mirror? Do they see themselves in this struggle? And what do we have to do intentionally to set that space so that our young activists, particularly building that multiracial coalition that Candis talked about, of everybody but the people who are out and out haters, needs to come together and say, this is how we build solidarity and progress. And sometimes it's about saying, the same folks who want you to divide you by race or by ethnicity or place of origin or who you worship or who you love are the same people that want to get rid of any protections, environmental protections that save our communities from toxicity and poison from the earth. So to some degree, talking about our class, our class solidarity, and ensuring that's in the basis of multiracial efforts to challenge supremacy, to challenge this very toxic agenda that your president and far too many others across the world are playing out in these days of uncertainty.
Yeah, and if I may, I just want to take this, because this is a challenge, my call to task the labor leaders who across this country have been skeptical about a transition of jobs. I had an opportunity to go and visit Denmark a few years back with many other union leaders, with the leadership of Green Jobs New York. And what I saw was prime evidence that the just transition can lead to good paying jobs. When we were having an argument here in the States, I know people hate it when we talk about other countries, but we were having arguments about $15 an hour. They had already transitioned to $20 an hour. You know, the density of membership was 90%. And tied to that density was a complete shift in their economy, that they went to a service-oriented economy to a green, renewable, sustainable jobs economy led by their offshore wind industry. That transformed the country, transformed the social net, safety net, and helped to re-engineer a whole new society around the issue of environmental and economic justice. We were talking about $15 an hour as if it was a handout, folks. $15 an hour. And these folks had already surpassed all of that. And as a result of it, they had this whole study about how happy the workers were. And it was a perfect example, but it was the union leaders in Denmark who got together and say, we can't keep doing this. We can't keep seeing, you know, as Einstein has often said, define insanity as doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. That's what we're doing. We're repeating a lot of the mistakes that we're seeing it now. So I appreciate your comments, Sean. Let me just turn it over because Jeremy, I think, has other questions, and I have a couple of other questions that have been asked since we started this conversation. Jeremy.
Yeah, we have another question that's come in. As New York City and state continue to invest in renewable energy solutions to power the grid, how can we make sure marginalized communities are not left behind?
Anyone wants to take over? Larry?
Sure. I think it goes back to that other question you asked, that someone asked. And the key part of that question that really stuck with me is, how do you center racial and economic justice, right? Frankly, you know, having an advocate and having someone that actually brings up how something is going to impact a particular community is priceless, you know? And I think that for labor leaders who are moving in that space in New York, asking yourself simple questions like, do I have a person of color? Do I have the community that I represent? Do I have a person from that community in the room? Are they speaking for themselves? Am I allowing them the space to say what they think or what their experiences are? You know, because if there's a good chance that if they're not feeling that comfort, then the reason is that they don't feel represented. You know, speaking for myself, I think that whether it's New York or the West Coast, you know, a lot of these spaces, Candis kind of brought this up, a lot of these spaces are very white. And, you know, I've seen an effort over the years to bring in more people of color into these discussions around economic justice and environmental justice. But I still think that there's a lot to be desired there. And I also think just having a person of color in the room doesn't necessarily mean that you're giving them the prominence and respect that they deserve to express what they're going through and what their community is going through. If you grew up in any of the cities that I grew up all around the country, not only are you concerned on a daily basis about, you know, maybe getting the police called on you for doing everyday activities, but you're also concerned about, you know, the different type of education you get when you're in the classroom, how you're being treated differently by a teacher. Women are dealing with, you know, having a higher mortality rate of the babies in the hospital. There's just the cumulative impact of all of the things that we have to worry about on a daily basis. In addition to, you know, the climate impacts means that if you want someone who is a person of color to contribute to what you're trying to build and to try to give input so that you have balance, you're going to have to amend your expectations of that person. Meaning, you know, they're not tokenizing, not expecting someone to automatically know everything as if they were already given this information, right? The only reason that I've been able to stay in this space this long and been able to survive is because I've just weathered a lot of things, to be honest with you. And I don't want us to bring in all of these people of color into these conversations with good intentions just to burn them out or make them turn sour on these movements. But the truth is, we can't be successful without them. So I really think success in New York looks like success everywhere. It takes a commitment and like an honest effort to like learn who these communities are and listen to them and then support them in their leadership.
Yeah, I'm interested in what you have to say there. At times that I speak with friends of mine in the labor movement in Canada, who they speak of us as the like the meth lab neighbors downstairs in a way that sometimes it's sobering. So from your perspective, I'm curious as to what you think. How do we transform this? Because I know there's been a lot of discussion about hydro and about purchasing power and about what it means and the whole regionality of things, and whether in fact that's helping or hurting this wage gap that exists between workers here in the US and Canada. What's your perspective on this?
Well, you know, there's some big differences in our movement. And I'm a firm believer that union renewal is got to be how we discover a new course to social justice in both of our countries. And that renewal is very much based on an organizing model. I'm an organizer by nature. It's one of the reasons, you know, the construction industry in Toronto is the highest level of unionization, is because we went out and engaged newcomer communities to say that, you know, right now people are looking down your nose at you, but we want you to come and get a union card. And if you don't have the, you know, the current skills, we're going to train you and your niece and nephew to come in. But that was an organizing strategy. It wasn't a charity strategy. It was how do we continue to be strong? And similarly now around the question of, you know, going back to Larry and Candis's comments about, you know, do folks of color see themselves in a place of power in this movement or not? And that's a lot of tough work. And, you know, we've been fortunate that we've been able in certain parts of this country to really have a strong consensus of leaders to say they want to work on that, want to make the space, and they want to learn. And, you know, since that 8 minutes and 46 seconds, George Floyd, the conversations that we've had in this city from our particularly Black members and leaders are unlike any we've had in the 50 years before that. And so there's a moment in time to combine a commitment to, you know, naming and tackling systemic racism, empowering a movement based on who the working class actually is, in who we all actually are, in the diversity that's real, and creating a common purpose around a sustainable world. And I will just say, because we're a city of immigrants and refugees, the issue of climate refugees, you know, you guys, Hurricane Sandy was a huge wake-up call. Well, for all of us, what's going to happen with millions of people that are who are in despair? And I'm going to end with this phrase that somebody, a refugee proponent, talked about in the Mediterranean, saying, try to understand, nobody puts their children into a boat unless the water is safer than the land. And that's a reminder to all of us that the action we take today will impact 7 generations from now, as our Indigenous people say, and we better think about those actions and whether or not people will find the water safer than the land in generations from now.
Thank you, John. And so as we begin to close, Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter. I want to say that repeatedly, emphatically, without apology to anything that, without fear of offending anyone. I'm going to turn it over to Candis, who was last. Now you'll be first. Some closest remark, Candis. We have a couple of minutes left.
Sure. So I thought this panel was great. Thank you all again for inviting me. I think, you know, I'll just repeat what Henry says, Black Lives Matter. And we have to continue to center the folks that are most impacted in the solution to the work. And it may be hard because, like Larry said, we're juggling a lot of different issues, but this issue is important. And it's just about making sure that folks are connected to it and see themselves in the issue. And once you see it, there's no way that you don't join the fight. But it's just making sure that we create these spaces and we have leadership that are folks of color who can talk to these issues from a race perspective and explain how climate change and climate injustice impacts us on a personal level and on a community level. And then more and more, you'll see more and more folks that look like me joining this fight. And that's how we win.
Thank you, Candis. Larry, some closing thoughts.
I don't think I could say it better than that. You know, I'm happy to see that organizations on the left are starting to really take this stuff seriously. I am concerned that an organization simply saying Black Lives Matter or saying that, you know, we care about Breonna Taylor or that we care about George Floyd is like having a union label or something, right? Like, I want to see action. What does that mean to you? How am I going to see in your union contract and your community benefits agreement, your PLA, that you're taking equity into account? Like, I don't want to hear we only focus on bread and butter, right? It's like a dog whistle for the contract has to be ABC. Like, we are the movement that should be leading the change that this country is going through right now. And we can only do that if we include people who have been historically excluded from the conversation. I really appreciate being included in this discussion.
Well said. Thank you, Larry. John?
I'll end with the slogan that our labor movement, many years ago, when we chose to be a social justice movement, not just a collective bargaining movement. Very famous slogan that what we wish for ourselves, we wish for all. And that's got to be what drives people that look like me in alliance and coalition and co-conspiracy with activists and leaders of color and with the young generation that wants to have a world they can actually inherit and live with.
Thank you. Let me just thank all panelists and thank all those who have participated and my co-host, Jeremy John, for helping me in this process. There were some questions, unfortunately, we cannot get to due to time constraints, but hopefully we'll be able to address some of them. And we still have a long way to go this day with the panel, several other a panel, and also with the award ceremony. So please stay tuned. Thank you all for participating. And this concludes this panel.